Hello, welcome to episode 22. Today we'll be talking about Python functions, which are also referred to as methods commonly. And a function is just a block of code which runs when it's called. You can pass data known as parameters or arguments into a function, and it can return data as a result. So in Python, we use the def keyword to create a function. This is short for define. We'll just call this function1. We won't be taking any arguments. We use a colon here, and then we indent down to the next line, and here is whatever we want the function to do. So we will just have our function print I'm a function. We can go ahead and save that. Now notice if we just try to run, kind of like we've been doing, if we just run 22 here, we're not getting anything back, and that's because we're not executing our function. So to call a function, we actually have to come down here, type the name of the function, followed by the parentheses. So right here we have function1, and we're telling it here now to execute this function. So now if we save, come down to pi, and we run it, we see I'm a function. Arguments, when using functions, would go in here. So you could just have an argument, something like arg1, which we'll just do. And we'll pass an argument in. We'll see like what we want to pass in. I'm a function named excuse me, blank, and then we'll just have it be plus arg1, which really we should just name this name. Let's name that name. So remember to name your arguments and functions something valid so they're easy to read. And then we'll just take a string argument here, and we'll just say Bob. And you see now we have I'm a function named Bob. So we're passing in the function when we passing into the function an argument when we call it. So our argument is the string Bob. So when we execute function1, it just takes whatever we passed in and it applies it to name, and then for the output it outputs whatever we've applied to name. So you could call the same function multiple times with different arguments. Execute, and you see that we get the same beginning output here, this string that we've defined, and then the variable name, the argument, changes. So okay, so you'll hear me call these arguments or parameters. I usually end up calling them arguments. Those terms can be used for the same thing, which is just info that we're passing into a function. But from a function perspective, just know a parameter is the variable listed inside the parentheses in the function definition. An argument is the value that is sent to the function when it's called. So just know that, but they're pretty much interchangeable. By default, a function must be called with the correct number of arguments. So here we're only taking one argument. If we start trying to pass in extra arguments, then when we try to run it, we see we get an error. And Python's awesome and tells us exactly what the error is, right? One positional argument, but two were given. This would be the same if you need two arguments. So let's just comment these out really quick. Change this to Rogers, and then we'll just say name plus last name, and we will change this to last name. And we should probably put a space in there. And that did not come through. Oh, I didn't save. Okay. There. So now you see I'm a function named Bob Rogers. So now if we take out Rogers and we just try to pass in Bob, only one argument, we're also getting the same type of error. We're missing one of the required positional arguments this time instead of having too many positional arguments. So similar, slightly different error. If you don't know how many arguments you'll have that will get passed into your function, you can add an asterisk before the parameter. So we'll just write a new function for this, call it function2, and we'll just call them arguments. Our colon, and then we can print, and we'll just use like grocery items for this. So we'll just say grocery item space, plus arg. And when you do it this way, it's going to take it in as a tuple. So it passes all the arguments into a tuple. So you can access that just with like one of these tuple indexes here. And then you can do something like function 2. And then we'll pass in carrots, milk, if I could put the commas in the right place, and t. So let me fix that really quick. And also spell function correctly. Save, we run it, and you see that we get grocery item milk back. So args is just usually arbitrary arguments, or often shortened to the asterisk args in the Python documentation. We can also do key value pairs here instead of these like straight args. So what I mean by that is we can do like item 1, item 2, item 3, and then we want to change this, and we'll just have it print item 3 for us. If I can type. And then what we need to do is come down here and assign key value pairs to all of these. And it doesn't matter what order we put them in, it's going to look for item 3 for this specific string anyway. So we can make item 3 here carrots, and we'll just do that by saying item 3 equals carrots. After the comma, make item 1 equal milk, and item 2 equal tea. Go ahead and save that. And even if we're passing them in but not using them, that's why it shows these are like dull or dim, because we're not calling them. So that's useful to find if you ever assign variables that are useless or not being utilized. That's a good way to hunt them down. And then you see here when we print, we don't get any errors, but we do get grocery item carrots, which is item 3 here, and it is item 3 that we're passing in as arguments, even though it's first. If you don't know how many keyword arguments, which is these key value pairs, that you'll be passing in, you can use something that's kind of like a keyword argument, but it looks like the word quargs. So it actually is like this. So if you ever see that, that's what we're referring to as keyword arguments. So the way to do that in Python here is we can have function 3, and you do a double asterisk, and this will actually pass a dictionary in instead of a tuple. So you could have like person here, and we'll print plus, and then we'll do our person here, and then we want some value, so we'll just do last name here. And then when we call the function, we can pass in like a first name, go ahead, save that, and we see my last name is Rogers. The reason that I show you this quargs or keyword arguments phrasing is because if you look at the Python documentation, this is how it's going to appear. Okay, now we'll cover default values, which is a good idea a lot of times, just if you have something that you don't want to break, if it doesn't return something. So in here we can just do name, and we'll set our default value equal to Bob. And then we'll print again. As we did up above, and then save. And then if we call function 4, and we pass in different names, and then nothing, we can go ahead, save that, execute, and you see that we get the names that we passed in, Steve and Robert. Then we get Bob from up here, the default value, and then Dave. So if you're doing some kind of a thing where you're calling this function and passing this name through, and in here you're maybe doing something where you're storing a name and you have no value. You don't want to store no value. So it's good to set like a default value in those situations. And just know that in functions, you can pass in any data type as an argument to a function. So it could be a string, it could be an integer, it could be a list, a dictionary, set, tuple, whatever. So we'll use that, we'll define here def function 5. We'll take in our argument and we'll just call this names just to stay on the name topic. And then we can build our for loop in here. So for name in names, and we can just print name. And we'll loop over whatever we pass in. And then here we'll call our function 5. And I want to assign that to a variable. So we'll just say like people, just to keep it a little different than names. Show how it works. And so here we'll have our Bob, we'll have our Dave, we'll have our Robert, and that's good enough. When we call function 5 here, we'll pass in people. If you're ever having like issues, I'll kind of cover it in a sec, but make sure that you're assigning your variable before you're putting it into a function as an argument. So order matters. Like I'll just go over it next, but let's just see how this works. So you see that it loops through our list that we passed in as an argument, and even though it's called people here, it just calls it names as the argument. So then we loop through names, which is actually people, and we print each name. So we're doing that. So now I'm going to cover some stuff. So if we move this function up here and we print it, you see that we get an error. And the reason is because it's not defined yet. Remember that when it's executing, it's from top down. So you have to have these things in order. Just like if we were to take this and put it here, people's not going to be defined yet. So don't want to do that. Just make sure that things are in the right order, that your indenting is solid. And just so you know, by the way, usually in Python you actually indent 4 times. I don't feel like changing my whole editor since I'm mostly in JavaScript, but you would normally do like that. So just know that you will see that very commonly in Python. And it's not a huge deal. It's just really because Python's so picky about indentation. So if you jump into someone else's code base, I'd probably just do it the way they're doing it. And you will see this, the 2 spaces in Python as well, especially if you jump into something that I write. Now we can have functions return a value. And this is very, very common that you will have a function return something. So we'll have function 6 here, and we'll just pass in a num, and we'll just have it return 2 times that num. We'll go ahead and save that, and then we will come down here and call function 6, pass in 2. And the reason it's not printing anything is because we're just returning it. So when you run it with a return, we're not doing anything that's printing this. So you can, what we could do is we could have actually another function if we want that prints it, or we could just print it by setting the value to something. So we could just say like x equals 2 times num, and then we could return x, and we could also print x, just so you can visualize this. Save, and so it is working, and it is returning those. We're just only calling them here. Excuse me. So we're not doing anything with the return value when that happens. So normally you would have like another function that calls a function, that function returns a value, and then whatever that value is, the original function could print out. So you could call another function here, and we could have function 7 actually take in the num, and then function 6 could also take in a number. So what we do here is we just pass in num here. We'll call function 6 inside of this. We will pass num to function 6. Function 6 will actually return this. So we can actually just take this, paste it back so we have more of our original example. Get rid of this. So it's going to do that, and we will assign that to a variable. So we will make x equal whatever we get back from here, we'll assign to x, and then we will print x. And this is actually more realistically how you see functions work. And then we're actually calling the wrong functions, so my bad. And then now you see we're getting that same output, but we've broken it down into multiple functions now, which is how you actually want to do it. You want to isolate working parts, and you want functions to be usually as small as possible so that they're as readable as possible. And if you have a bug, it's really easy to track down the bug to the single function. And then just remember, if we have a function 8 here that takes no arguments and it doesn't return anything, and we call function 8 and we execute it here, so it's actually thinking that this should be the argument in here, which is not wrong. So Python's actually reading this and saying like, hey, your function doesn't do anything, right? So if you try to run this, it's not going to work, and it thinks it's because this is not indented, because it's assuming that this should be part of the function. So again, you can do the pass. Now if we save it and run it, there's no errors. So even though this function is doing nothing, we can still execute it, and it won't give us an error because it's got this pass statement. Okay, and to wrap up, I'm going to just touch on recursion. Recursion is extremely useful, especially for data structure and algorithm stuff. I like recursion. You can solve a lot of problems with it in a much shorter syntax and much more logically than with not using it sometimes. So what is recursion? Python just accepts function recursion, which means that it can call itself. So you can call a function inside of its own function. The developer should be careful because you can write one that never terminates, and it can be one that uses excessive memory. So we can get into kind of like how stuff stacks, especially in JavaScript. That's really important. You have a thing called a call stack that recursive functions specifically tend to fill up. So we will just do a really quick example. I don't want to dive too deep into recursions because we can do an entire video on just recursions. So we'll just write like an example function here. Call it xfunc. Here it will take in an argument k. We'll say if k is greater than 0, then we will set result equal to k plus xfunc, and we'll pass in k minus 1. So we're calling this function inside of this function. So that's all recursion really is. Just be extremely careful if you're messing with this not to break everything. It won't like destroy your computer or anything, but it will crash programs, and it's just bad programming. So otherwise we'll set the result equal to 0, and we'll just return the result. And then we will do our function here, and we'll just pass in 6. All right, then we come down here, we execute, and we see the recursive method 1, 3, 6, 10, 15, 21. Again, that's going to seem very confusing possibly. Just know that the method is kind of building a pyramid and then collapsing that pyramid. That's how I visualize it, and I'll explain that better. We'll go over recursion specifically in its own video once we start using it for something. But thank you, and please practice with these if you're confused at all, and comment any questions, and we'll keep diving into stuff. But This is the nuts and bolts of programming right here. This is what makes everything happen.